The Moneyball of football. How Brighton built a $500 million club from absolutely nothing. Now, to understand how wild this story really is, and how a quiet, under-the-radar revolution is completely changing the landscape of the biggest sport in the world, I want you to focus on one single, unbelievable number.
£115 million. Seriously, just let that sink in for a second. In August of 2023, a football club on the south coast of England sold one single player for £115 million. Now, massive transfers happen in football all the time, right? But here is the catch. They had bought him just 2 years earlier for around $4.5 million.
Bought for $4.5 million, sold for $115. That is a 25 times return on a single human being. And here's the part that nobody really tells you. It wasn't a fluke. It wasn't some lucky scout sitting in the right stadium on a rainy Tuesday night who just happened to spot a superstar. No, it was a system. A repeatable, cold, almost mechanical system for turning completely unknown players into nine-figure assets.
Section 1. League One to Data. Okay, so to truly grasp how absurd this whole data-driven system is, we have to look at where Brighton actually came from. This wasn't some sleeping giant with a massive global fan base. Not long ago, this was a club that literally had to sell its own stadium just to survive. 15 years ago, they were languishing way down in the third division of English football. They were nearly bankrupt, scraping by and playing their home games in a borrowed athletic stadium, like with a running track around the pitch and everything. Today, they compete in European competitions, they sell players to the biggest clubs on earth for staggering, record-breaking profits, and they hold a valuation in the hundreds of millions of dollars. And the craziest part? They did it without billionaire oil money or some massive sovereign wealth fund. They did it with math.
Things were incredibly bleak back in 1997. The club was essentially forced to sell their historic Goldstone ground just to clear out their debts. For years, they were basically homeless in their own city. But in 2009, everything shifted. A man named Tony Bloom took control. He poured in tens of millions of his own money, reportedly around £90 million, just to stabilize the club's finances and finally build them a proper, permanent home. By 2011, the doors to the beautiful Amex Stadium opened, which signaled a whole new era. And then, by 2017, they achieved what many thought was completely impossible: promotion to the Premier League, arguably the most lucrative and competitive football league on the planet.
But here's the thing. Money alone didn't save this club. If we're being honest, plenty of owners have spent way more money in football and achieved way less. Throwing cash at a football club is usually a fantastic way to lose a fortune. What made Tony Bloom different was exactly how he thought about the game itself. Because Bloom isn't your typical football owner. He's not an oil sheik, and he's not a traditional American hedge fund manager treating the club like a real estate asset. He is a professional gambler. In fact, he is widely considered one of the most successful, calculating sports bettors who has ever lived.
Section 2. The secret recruitment algorithm. That totally unique background led Bloom to ask a question that would completely change the sport. What if you could scout players the exact same way you beat the bookies? Hold on to that question, because absolutely everything Brighton has become flows directly from it. And we're about to open up the machine to see exactly how it works.
So the core engine of their unparalleled success comes from a company Tony Bloom built years before he ever owned a football club. It's called Star Lizard. Their job was simple to describe, but almost impossible to do. Use enormous, unprecedented amounts of data to predict football matches more accurately than the global betting markets. And man, it worked spectacularly. They were famously outsmarting the market for years. But then Bloom realized something massive. The exact same data, the same underlying metrics that tell you who's going to win a match, can also tell you which individual players are systematically undervalued by the transfer market. So in 2017, he spun that predictive engine off into a second, highly secretive company aimed purely at football recruitment. That company is Jamestown Analytics. So how does this algorithm actually operate day to day? Well, it constantly scans the entire planet. We are talking about tracking thousands of players across obscure leagues that most fans have never even heard of. It isn't looking for the famous, expensive superstar whose highlights are all over social media. No, it looks for the underlying statistical profile that screams a player will succeed in the relentless environment of the Premier League, even while his current real-world price tag says he won't. Then they execute a highly guarded, mechanical four-step loop. First, identify the undervalued player before anyone else does. Second, develop him with elite coaching and a tailored system. Third, sell high into a giant, desperate club for 10, 20, or even 30 times what you initially paid. And finally, reinvest every single penny into finding the next undervalued gem. One insider actually compared this model to KFC's secret recipe. Absolutely everyone can taste the result, but nobody outside the kitchen knows exactly what's in it.
Section 3. the transfer profit receipts. Let's pivot into the hard evidence of the Brighton model in action. Because, in the ruthless business of modern football, a theory is really only as good as its receipts.
Start with Moisés Caicedo, a teenager playing in Ecuador that almost nobody in Europe had ever heard of, bought for around £4.5 million, developed, and then sold to Chelsea for a staggering £115 million. Then there's Alexis McAllister, plucked from Argentina for roughly £7 million. He goes on to win the World Cup and is sold to Liverpool for an initial £35 million that could easily rise past 50. Yves Bissouma, bought for £15 million, sold to Tottenham for £25. But João Pedro, that is where it gets incredibly interesting. Bought from Watford for about £30 million, which was a wildly high price by Brighton's usual frugal standards. People thought they had massively overpaid, but just 2 years later, they flip him to Chelsea for up to £60 million. It proves they aren't just good at buying cheap, they are absolute masters of knowing exactly when to sell, striking right at the absolute peak of a player's perceived market value.
That mechanical loop has generated well over £300 million in pure transfer profit in recent years. $300 million. To truly put that scale in perspective, even in the summer of 2025, a transfer window that football critics and journalists actually called quiet for Brighton, they still walked away with around £70 million in net income. A quiet $70 million. That tells you everything you need to know about how consistently dominant this system really is.
Section 4. Why nobody can copy this. This brings us to the question that actually matters, the one that keeps rival executives up at night in cold sweats. If this model is so brilliant, so profitable, why hasn't every giant, wealthy club in the world just copied it? Well, they've certainly tried, and mostly they've completely failed.
There are 4 specific reasons why this operation is nearly impossible to replicate. First, the data itself is genuinely proprietary and secret. It comes from over 20 years of grinding and iterating in the ruthless betting industry. You can't just download this off the internet or buy it from some vendor. Second, extreme patience. The model only works if you're willing to buy a teenager from Japan or Ecuador, loan him out, and wait years for him to mature. Big clubs with massive, demanding fan bases, they just do not have that kind of patience. Third, you have to be willing to sell your best players every single year. Brighton openly accepts that losing great players is simply the cost of doing business. They sell the player, but they keep the system intact. And fourth, it all rests on Tony Bloom's unique genius, that rare, once-in-a-generation combination of mathematician, gambler, and passionate owner. In fact, they are so remarkably confident in this system that in late 2024, Brighton did something historically unthinkable. They fired, actually scratch that, they didn't just fire a few. They fired most of their traditional human talent scouts, deciding to lean even harder into the cold, hard algorithm.
Section 5. The Multi-Club Data Empire. Because the secret is officially leaking out and a quiet revolution is currently taking over Europe.
Tony Bloom isn't just exporting ideas anymore. He is actively building a footballing empire. He's invested his capital and his algorithm in clubs far beyond Brighton. There's Union Saint-Gilloise in Belgium, which has been utilized as a brilliant low-pressure development bridge to test incoming global talent before they ever have to face the Premier League. And more recently, he's taken a stake in the historic Scottish club Hearts. Think about what that actually means for the future of the sport. We're looking at a connected, multi-club network that is all feeding off the exact same proprietary algorithm, moving players seamlessly between borders and hunting undervalued talent across the globe with a synchronized, machine-like precision.
The ultimate takeaway of this explainer is incredibly simple. The age of the loud billionaire owner simply spending his way to unearned glory is being seriously challenged. It's being challenged by something quieter, colder, and far more dangerous. A spreadsheet that knows exactly which player is about to be worth £100 million years before anyone else on earth does. Brighton proved that you don't actually need the most money to win at the highest level. You need the best information, because eventually, data beats money.
So, the next time you see a tiny club sell a relatively unknown player for an unbelievable record-breaking fee, ask yourself, was that luck? Or was it a machine running quietly in the background that saw it coming years ago? If you found this fascinating, there's a whole world of these stories out there. Clubs and businesses completely dominating their fields by winning with information instead of just money. Subscribe and I'll show you the next one. Who do you think is the real Moneyball Club? Tell me in the comments.